For centuries, the history of Western philosophy has been written as though it were the history of human logic itself. European intellectuals did not simply promote their own ideas. They presented their specific, local cultural idioms as the objective baseline for all rationality. French philosopher Jacques Derrida identified a severe flaw in this assumption. His critique provides a crucial starting point for understanding the modern crisis in African philosophy. This text is the opening page of Sene Sarakariburn's Introduction to African Philosophy. It leads with Derrida's concept of a white mythology. Derrida argues that the West takes its own localized mythos, its specific Indo-European history and linguistics, and mistakes it for the universal form of reason. It is a regional logic masquerading as an objective global standard. To construct an authentic definition of African philosophy, scholars must first actively dismantle this assumed, imported standard of what counts as valid logic. This specific volume, Sene Sarakariburn's anthology, African Philosophy, The Essential Readings, serves as our map for how that reconstruction is happening. In compiling this text, the editor enforced a strict boundary condition. He explicitly excluded all non-African voices. There are no foreign mediators framing the debate, and no outside moderators guiding the discussion. This exclusion is a deliberate theoretical strategy. To escape the gravity of Western philosophical standards, the discourse requires a highly insulated environment. African scholars need the space to confront one another directly, testing their ideas against each other without constantly justifying their existence to a European audience. The result of this containment reveals that African philosophy is not a single, unified worldview. It is a highly fractured, rigorous, and often combative theoretical debate. This book functions less like a standard textbook and more like a sealed arena. It isolates these scholars to force necessary internal friction, defining an autonomous discursive space in the process. The contemporary academic debate surrounding African philosophy can be traced back to a single inflection point. In 1945, a Belgian missionary named Father Placide Tempels published Bantu Philosophy. Tempels aimed to document the mindset of ethnic Africans. His goal was largely utilitarian, to categorize the local population to assist the European colonial enterprise. Regardless of his colonial motivations, Tempels' work acts as the root node for the entire modern discipline. Every subsequent movement responds to it. The first major branch to grow from this text is a school of thought known as ethno-philosophy. Thinkers in this camp, like Nigerian philosopher Innocent Onyeweni, took Tempels' documentary premise and formalized it. Their primary methodological objective is to extract and record the implicit traditional worldviews of various African ethnic groups. They work to structure indigenous proverbs, myths, and ethical practices into an academic framework. Ethnophilosophy ultimately treats African thought as a historical artifact, something to be carefully excavated from the past and defended against Western intellectual erasure. Treating philosophy as an archaeological dig generated a fierce intellectual backlash. This reaction formed the second major branch of our taxonomy, the Universalist or Scientistic school. This movement is driven by scholars like Pauline Hontanji, Kwasi Wairidu, and Peter O. Badunran. They share an aggressive rejection of the idea that uncritical traditional wisdom or folklore can be categorized as formal philosophy. Instead, they insist that philosophy must be defined strictly as a rigorous, culture-neutral scientific methodology. For these thinkers, African is merely a geographic designation. It describes where the universal science of philosophy takes place, but it does not modify the rules of the science itself. Sitting precariously between these two extremes is Henry Odera Aruka and his concept of philosophic sagacity. Aruka bridges the gap by identifying traditional sages who actively engage in the rigorous, critical thinking demanded by universalists. The universalist approach successfully strips away cultural mysticism, but it introduces a massive risk. By insisting on a completely neutral scientific method, they often blindly import Western frameworks, unintentionally mimicking the exact white mythology Derrida warned against. Recognizing the fatal flaws in both previous models leads directly to a third methodological camp. This is the historico-hermeneutical school. It is defined by voices like Marcian Toa, Okanda Okolo, Oyenka Owomoyela, and E. Wamba Diawamba. This group explicitly rejects ethnophilosophy's habit of looking backward to preserve static artifacts, but they equally reject the universalists' illusion that any scientific methodology can ever truly be culture neutral. Instead, they argue that African philosophy must operate as a critical hermeneutics. Practically, this requires direct engagement with the continent's specific history, its political dynamics, and the material realities of contemporary African life. For this camp, true philosophical method cannot be dug up from the tribal past, nor can it be cleanly imported from European universities. It has to be forged strictly in the fires of present material conditions and immediate lived realities. When we take this abstract taxonomy and map it back onto the physical text, we return to the anthology. Looking at this table of contents, we see these exact methodological camps placed side by side. The structure of the book itself forces ethnophilosophers, universalists, and hermeneuticists into a confined, inescapable dialogue. In his introduction, Sarah Karabrahan describes this exact dynamic as a process of theoretical threshing. Threshing is a violently utilitarian act. It is the agricultural process of beating harvested crops to separate the nutrient-rich grain from the useless chaff. When applied to these intellectuals, the internal clash acts as the threshing floor. The friction between these competing schools separates useful methodological tools from useless assumptions. What emerges from this process is a philosophical foundation that relies entirely on internal rigor rather than validation from Western institutions. African philosophy is not a static list of proverbs or a single unified worldview. It is an active, evolving intellectual practice. It exists entirely within the friction of these competing theories, constantly refining itself to address the immediate, lived problems of the African continent.